Imagine your country is on fire. Not literally, but financially. Banks are frozen. Your currency has collapsed overnight. Unemployment is spiking toward 10%, then 15%, then higher. Ordinary people, teachers, fishermen, nurses, are watching their savings evaporate in real time. The phone rings. It's the International Monetary Fund. And they say, "We can help, but there are conditions." Every country in modern history has answered that call, signed the papers, swallowed the medicine. And for most of them, the medicine was worse than the disease. But in 2008, one small island in the North Atlantic looked at that phone and hung up. This is the story of Iceland, the country that said no to the banks, no to the bailout, and no to the IMF's playbook. And somehow, won. To understand what Iceland did, you need to understand what everyone else did first. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, it was like a bomb going off in slow motion inside the global banking system. Lehman Brothers collapsed in September. Credit markets froze worldwide. Governments panicked. The standard response, the IMF approved, Wall Street endorsed, economist-blessed response was this: save the banks. Make the public pay for it later. In the United States, $700 billion went to bail out the institutions that caused the crash. In Ireland, the government guaranteed all bank debt, saddling ordinary citizens with losses that weren't theirs. In Greece, the IMF arrived with a rescue package that came with brutal austerity: pension cuts, wage slashing, mass unemployment. The formula was always the same. Privatize the profits, socialize the losses. Now, Iceland. Iceland is a volcanic island of 330,000 people. Its GDP in 2008 was roughly $17 billion. Small, remote, irrelevant to global finance, or so everyone thought. Then its three major banks collapsed, and the numbers were staggering. The total debt of those three banks, 10 times Iceland's entire GDP. Think about that. Imagine your household earns $50,000 a year, and your bank suddenly owes $500,000 in bad debts. And someone is telling you to pay it back. That's what Iceland was facing. Here's how Iceland got into this mess. Through the early 2000s, Iceland's banks went on an aggressive expansion spree. They deregulated rapidly after the 1990s, allowed private ownership of the major banks. And those banks, Kaupthing, Landsbanki, Glitnir, started operating like hedge funds in suits. They borrowed short, they lent long, they expanded into the UK, the Netherlands, across Europe. They offered high-interest IceSave accounts to hundreds of thousands of foreign depositors chasing yield. It was a classic carry trade, dressed up as banking. Think of it this way. Imagine you take out a loan at 3% interest. You lend that money out at 9%. On paper, you look rich. You keep borrowing more, lending more, growing faster, until the day your lender asks for the money back, and you don't have it. That's what happened to Iceland's banks in October 2008. Within days, all three collapsed. The stock market fell 90%. The Icelandic krona lost half its value. And suddenly, foreign governments, Britain, the Netherlands, were knocking on Iceland's door, demanding repayment for deposits their citizens had lost. Britain actually invoked anti-terrorism legislation to freeze Icelandic assets. Anti-terrorism legislation against Iceland, a country with no army. The IMF arrived. The message was familiar. You must repay the foreign creditors. You must impose austerity, cut government spending, raise taxes, protect the bondholders. This is the moment every government caves. This is the moment Iceland didn't. Iceland's government initially agreed. In 2008, they accepted an IMF loan of $2.1 billion. The first IMF loan to a Western European country since the UK in 1976. But the Icelandic people had a different idea. Citizens took to the streets in what became known as the Pots and Pans Revolution. Protesters banged cookware outside the Parliament building, the Althing, until the government fell. New elections, new leadership, and then something genuinely unprecedented happened. Iceland's president, Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson, refused to sign the legislation that would have forced Icelandic taxpayers to repay the British and Dutch governments. He sent it to a national referendum instead. In 2010, Icelanders voted no, 93% against. In 2011, a second revised deal was put to referendum. Again, no, 60% against. The people had spoken, twice. Meanwhile, Iceland did something else that made global financial elites deeply uncomfortable. They let the banks fail. No bailout. Kaupthing, Landsbanki, Glitnir, gone. Not restructured, not quietly absorbed. Failed. Their domestic operations were separated and protected. The foreign creditors. They took the losses. Then Iceland did something almost unheard of in the post-2008 world. They prosecuted the bankers, not fined them, not gave them strongly worded letters. Prosecuted. Criminally. The CEOs and senior executives of the failed banks were arrested, tried, and sentenced. Over 26 bankers eventually went to prison, including the heads of the major institutions. In the United States, where the same reckless behavior destroyed far more wealth, not a single senior banker went to prison. Let that contrast sink in. Iceland also imposed capital controls, limiting money leaving the country, and allowed its currency to depreciate sharply, making exports and tourism competitive again. They protected their welfare state, maintained healthcare, maintained education, shielded the most vulnerable from the worst cuts, unlike Greece, where austerity gutted public services for a decade. The IMF and global financial press predicted catastrophe. Iceland, they said, would be a financial pariah, locked out of bond markets, unable to borrow, an economic wasteland. They were wrong. By 2011, just 3 years after the collapse, Iceland's economy was growing again. By 2015, it had fully recovered to pre-crisis GDP levels. Unemployment, which peaked around 9%, fell back to under 4%. Tourism boomed. The krona stabilized. Iceland was removed from IMF emergency lending by 2011. And in 2015, Iceland repaid its IMF loans ahead of schedule. Compare that to Greece, which followed the orthodox IMF playbook to the letter. Brutal austerity, creditor protection, full repayment enforced. By 2015, Greece's economy had shrunk by 25%. Youth unemployment hit 50%. An entire generation was economically destroyed. Greece is still recovering. 2 crises, 2 responses, radically different outcomes. The lesson embedded in Iceland's story isn't complicated, but it is deeply threatening to the people who run the global financial system. Banks are not too big to fail. Bankers are not too powerful to prosecute. Debt that cannot be repaid will not be repaid. And the people of a country do not owe their lives to the recklessness of private institutions. Iceland's story doesn't fit neatly into any ideology. It's not left-wing, it's not right-wing, it's not anti-capitalism. What it is a data point, a controlled experiment that the global financial establishment would rather you didn't examine too closely. Because if Iceland's approach worked, then every government that imposed austerity on its own people to protect foreign creditors has to answer a very uncomfortable question. For whom exactly were they governing? Iceland's recovery wasn't perfect. Capital controls had costs. The process was painful. Some foreign depositors were genuinely hurt. The legal battles dragged on for years. But the country survived. Its people were protected. Its democracy held. And the people responsible went to jail. In a world where financial crises have become routine, where the same institutions that caused the last crash are already building the next one, Iceland's story is less a history lesson and more a blueprint that powerful people keep hoping you'll forget. The question isn't whether another crisis is coming. The question is, when it does, who will your government choose? The banks or you? Iceland proved that a country can reject the IMF's playbook and survive, even thrive. But no major economy has followed its lead. Why do you think that is? Is Iceland the exception or the proof? Drop your answer below.